She walked into a high-end boutique expecting to shop, not to be humiliated. But when the manager told her she wasn't a serious buyer, she gave him a reality check he'll never forget. The scent of polished leather and expensive perfume clung to the air inside La Belle Couture, a place where wealth wasn't just displayed, it was expected. Shimmering displays of handbags sat beneath glowing spotlights, and rows of designer coats hung in perfect formation, each price tag more outrageous than the last, the kind of boutique where names carried more weight than money. 72-year-old Lorraine Hastings stepped inside, shaking off the crisp autumn air as the glass doors swung shut behind her. She adjusted her cream-colored cashmere coat, the one she'd owned for over a decade but took meticulous care of, and removed her chocolate-brown leather gloves. Her pace was unhurried, her posture upright, and her sharp gaze took in the store's carefully curated luxury. It wasn't her first time shopping in a high-end boutique, but something about today felt different. A young sales associate near the register glanced up, her polished red nails tapping against the counter. She looked Lorraine over once, just once, before quickly looking away, her mouth pulling into something close to a smirk. Lorraine ignored it. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She'd spent decades in lecture halls, molding the minds of future leaders. She'd sat on panels, debated the world's brightest scholars, and published books read by people she'd never met. She didn't need approval from a 20-something-year-old girl who probably didn't know the difference between real cashmere and a synthetic blend. Her eyes landed on a display case in the center of the boutique, where a deep emerald handbag sat encased in glass, the kind of piece that wasn't just an accessory, it was a statement. But before she could take a step toward it, movement caught her attention. A security guard, broad-shouldered and wearing an earpiece, shifted from his post near the entrance. He wasn't staring, not directly. But Lorraine had been alive long enough to recognize the signs, the subtle positioning, the slight turn of the head, the unnecessary awareness of her presence. She exhaled through her nose, letting the moment pass. Her fingers grazed a row of coats, feeling the textures, silk lining, hand-stitched seams, the kind of craftsmanship that was becoming rare. She picked one up, examining the tag. $3,200. She could buy 5 of them without blinking. But before she could even lower the hanger, a voice sliced through the air. "Ma'am?" the sales associate called, her tone light, yet laced with something Lorraine had heard too many times before. Doubt. Lorraine turned, raising an eyebrow. The girl approached, a tight-lipped smile on her face, the kind that was more for show than kindness. Her name tag read Vanessa, in sleek cursive. "Just so you know," Vanessa continued, "those pieces are quite expensive." Lorraine let the words settle between them. Expensive. As if she hadn't read the tag. As if she wasn't standing in one of the most exclusive boutiques in Charleston, South Carolina, because she could afford to be there. She could feel the eyes of the other employees, their silent judgments hanging in the air like a thick perfume. The security guard still lingered, not moving, but not ignoring her either. Lorraine smiled, small and measured. "Oh," she said, her voice smooth. "Is there a clearance rack I should be looking at instead?" A flicker of discomfort crossed Vanessa's face, but she recovered quickly. No, of course not," she said, laughing lightly. But the way her gaze flicked to the security guard for a brief second, that told Lorraine everything she needed to know. But instead of leaving, instead of giving them the satisfaction, she adjusted her gloves, lifted her chin, and stepped deeper into the store. They thought they knew who she was. They had no idea. But that wasn't the worst of it. Lorraine moved through the boutique with the same composure she carried in boardrooms and classrooms. She had faced tougher crowds, young minds eager to challenge authority, intellectuals who mistook arrogance for wisdom. A few sales associates with their noses in the air? That was nothing. Still, she felt it, the weight of unspoken assumptions. She reached for a navy blue cashmere coat, its tailoring impeccable, the craftsmanship evident in every stitch. but just as her fingers brushed the sleeve, a second voice joined the conversation. "That particular piece is part of our exclusive collection," another saleswoman chimed in, stepping from behind the counter. Tall, blonde, mid-40s, the kind of person who probably vacationed in Aspen and called it quaint. Lorraine didn't flinch. "Is that so?" she asked, turning the coat over in her hands, unimpressed but playing along. The woman's name tag read Melissa. Unlike Vanessa, she didn't bother with the fake cheerfulness. Her expression hovered between polite dismissal and mild irritation, as if she were indulging someone who had wandered into the wrong place. "Yes," Melissa said. "It's hand-stitched in Italy, custom-dyed fibers. We typically reserve these for our high-profile clients." The words weren't an outright rejection, but the meaning was clear. "You don't belong here." Lorraine traced a button between her fingers, letting a slow, amused smile curl at the corners of her lips. "Well, I suppose that would make me one of your high-profile clients, then, wouldn't it?" The slight twitch of Melissa's eyebrow was almost satisfying, but before she could respond, Vanessa interjected, her attempt at damage control clumsy at best. "Oh no, that's not what we meant," she said quickly, glancing at Melissa before turning back to Lorraine. "It's just that, well, we like to be sure our pieces go to the right homes." The right homes. Lorraine's stomach tightened, but she didn't let it show. She had spent her entire life dismantling expectations. The youngest black woman to become a tenured professor in her department, the only one on countless executive boards, the mentor to students who, like her, had been told what they could and couldn't achieve. And yet, here she was, in a boutique she owned, being told she wasn't the right kind of customer. She placed the coat back on the rack, her movements calm, measured. "I see," she said. A pause. "And does the store train you to say that, or is this a personal touch?" Vanessa paled, Melissa stiffened, and for the first time, the security guard shifted uncomfortably. Lorraine was no longer just another woman to brush off. But just as the tension thickened, another figure appeared. A man in a tailored suit, his steps crisp, his expression carefully neutral. The manager. Damien Caldwell. He had the look of someone who had climbed his way up in the industry. Expensive taste, but no real connection to the luxury he sold. His gaze flicked to Lorraine, then to his employees, assessing the situation within seconds. "Is there a problem here?" he asked smoothly, though the way his eyes lingered on Lorraine made it clear who he assumed the problem was. Melissa exhaled, clearly relieved. "Not at all, Mr. Caldwell," she said. "We were just explaining to this customer that some of our more exclusive pieces require approval before purchase." Lorraine tilted her head slightly, feigning curiosity. "Approval?" she repeated. "And who exactly is in charge of giving that approval?" Melissa hesitated. Damien answered for her. "We have protocols, of course," he said, offering a thin smile. "We like to ensure that serious buyers are taken care of." There it was. The final confirmation that they had already decided she wasn't one of them. Lorraine let the silence stretch just long enough to make them sweat. Then she reached into her purse, pulling out her phone with the kind of deliberate ease that only came with power. She was done playing along, and they were about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. The boutique was quiet, the kind of silence that stretched between held breaths. Lorraine tapped her phone screen, her expression unreadable. She wasn't angry. Not yet. She had lived long enough to know that anger was a gift best given at the right moment. Across from her, Vanessa fidgeted, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. Melissa, stiff and guarded, clutched the edge of the counter as if bracing herself. And Damien, oh, he was still wearing that thin, practiced smile, but there was something behind his eyes now, a flicker of doubt. "Ma'am, if you'd like, I can recommend some of our more accessible collections," Damien offered, his voice smooth, calculated. "We carry lovely scarves and accessories that might be more in line with your interests." Lorraine almost laughed. Accessories, as if she had walked in looking for a consolation prize. She exhaled through her nose, shaking her head slightly, then scrolled her phone screen until she found exactly what she needed. "You know," she started, "I find it interesting that you keep using that word." Damien's brow furrowed slightly. "What word?" Lorraine glanced up from her phone, her lips twitching into a small, knowing smile. "Serious?" A flicker of confusion crossed his face. "Excuse me?" She lifted her phone just enough for him to see the screen, angling it toward him like an afterthought. His name, Damien Caldwell, was at the top of an email chain. The subject line? "Performance review and annual store evaluations." Lorraine watched as his jaw locked. Vanessa and Melissa leaned forward slightly, their curiosity outweighing their caution. They couldn't see the details, but they saw his face. And in that moment, they knew something had shifted. Lorraine tilted her head, her voice still calm, still composed. "You see, I do take my shopping seriously," she continued. "Especially when it comes to stores I own." Damien's eyes flickered. Once to the phone, then back to her. The moment stretched too long. Melissa blinked. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean, own?" Lorraine let the silence settle before answering. "I mean," she said, slipping her phone back into her purse, "that I sign your paycheck." A single heartbeat. Then another. Vanessa's hand flew to her mouth. Melissa went rigid. And Damien? For the first time, his carefully curated mask cracked. Lorraine watched the weight of realization crash down on all of them. She had seen it before. That shift from arrogance to horror, the slow unraveling of someone who just realized they had made the worst mistake of their career. But she wasn't finished yet. Not even close. "You didn't know that, did you?" Lorraine asked, her voice light, almost amused. Damien opened his mouth, then closed it, then opened it again. "Miss Hastings, Dr. Hastings," she corrected smoothly. Vanessa let out an audible gulp. Melissa looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. Damien took a step back, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Of course, to Hastings," he corrected, his tone shifting so fast it was almost embarrassing. "Please understand, this is all just a misunderstanding." Lorraine held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Oh, I understand just fine," she said. "I understand that the minute I walked in here, you assumed I wasn't worth your time, that I wasn't worth these clothes or your courtesy. And I understand that the only reason you care now is because I have the power to decide whether or not you still have a job tomorrow." Another silence, this one cut deeper. Vanessa had turned pale. Melissa refused to meet Lorraine's eyes. And Damien, he was sweating now. Lorraine smoothed her coat, adjusted her gloves, and sighed. "But I'm not unreasonable," she said. "So I'll give you a choice." Damien stilled. "You can either explain to me why I should continue trusting you with my business," she let the weight of her words settle, "or you can go ahead and start drafting your resignation letter now." Either way, she was done playing along. The air inside Lavelle Couture had changed. The once smug and indifferent staff now stood frozen, their faces drained of confidence. The power had shifted, and they knew it. Damien Caldwell swallowed hard, struggling to regain control of the situation. The polished, well-groomed manager, who had been so quick to dismiss Lorraine, was now visibly shaken, his hands tightening at his sides. "Dr. Hastings," he started again, his voice thinner than before. "I assure you this was never about you personally. These policies are in place for all customers." Lorraine lifted an eyebrow, her expression unreadable. "All customers?" she echoed, tilting her head slightly. "Tell me something, Damien. How many other customers have you personally approached today to explain these policies?" He hesitated. Too long. Vanessa and Melissa darted nervous glances at each other, neither daring to answer for him. Damien started, then stopped. He had nothing, because they all knew the answer. Lorraine let the silence stretch just long enough to make them squirm. Then, with measured ease, she reached for the emerald handbag in the locked display case, the same one she had originally been eyeing. "Open it," she said, tapping her gloved finger against the glass. Damien blinked. "Excuse me?" I said, "Open it." Lorraine's voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the authority behind it. Damien fumbled for his keys, his movements no longer crisp and assured. When he finally unlocked the case, he carefully lifted the handbag and held it out to her, his fingers trembling slightly. Lorraine took it without a word, turning it over in her hands. The Italian leather was buttery soft. The stitching was impeccable. She already knew she would never carry it. It wasn't even her style. But that wasn't the point. She traced the engraved logo with her fingertips, then slowly turned to Vanessa and Melissa. "Would either of you like to suggest a price I can afford?" she asked, her voice as smooth as the silk lining of the handbag. Vanessa visibly recoiled. Melissa shifted uncomfortably, her lips pressed so tightly together they were nearly white. "Dr. Hastings, please," Damien interjected, his voice desperate now. "We truly regret any misunderstanding." Lorraine let out a soft, knowing laugh. "A misunderstanding," she mused. "That's interesting." She carefully set the handbag down on the glass counter, her gloved fingers lingering on it for just a second longer than necessary. "Because from where I'm standing, Damien, it looks less like a misunderstanding and more like a very clear message." Another weighted pause. Then, softly, dangerously softly, she asked, "Tell me, what exactly was it about me that made you so sure I wasn't a serious buyer?" Damien visibly paled. Melissa's nails dug into her own arms, her jaw clenched. Vanessa looked like she might cry. To Hastings, Damien stammered, his usual corporate poise crumbling. But Lorraine wasn't interested in excuses. She exhaled slowly, then reached into her purse, but not for her wallet. Instead, she pulled out a sleek, leather-bound notebook. She flipped it open, revealing a printed company letterhead. Damien's breathing hitched. "I was going to do this next week," Lorraine said, almost to herself. "But I suppose there's no harm in doing it now." She turned the notebook toward Damien, tapping her finger against the official-looking document. "You recognize this?" He nodded stiffly. "This is the quarterly performance report for Lavelle Couture," she continued. "And it just so happens that I was reviewing this store's numbers before I walked in." She turned a page. "Let's see. Declining sales in the last 2 quarters, customer complaints about staff attitude, and, here's an interesting one, multiple reports of discriminatory behavior toward certain clientele." Vanessa let out a sharp breath. Melissa stared at the floor. "Damien?" He looked like he wanted to throw up. "This store is already on my watch list," Lorraine said, snapping the notebook shut. "And you just confirmed why." She took a step closer, her gaze never wavering from Damien. "So, tell me, Damien," she said, lowering her voice. "What exactly do you think happens next?" And just like that, the floor beneath him was gone. Damien opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked like a man trying to stop an avalanche with his bare hands. The boutique, once filled with polite murmurs and curated ambiance, had become a vacuum of tension. Every employee in sight was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable fallout. Lorraine adjusted her gloves. She wasn't in a hurry. "Dr. Hastings," Damien finally managed, his voice suddenly lighter, almost frantic. "I assure you, we value every customer who walks through these doors. This was just an unfortunate misunderstanding. Nothing more." Lorraine tilted her head. "A misunderstanding," she repeated, letting the words roll off her tongue like she was tasting them for the first time. Damien nodded quickly. "Of course. You have to understand. We? Lorraine interrupted, her gaze unwavering. Damien hesitated. Vanessa and Melissa stood stiff as mannequins, both visibly wishing they were anywhere else. "Tell me, Damien," Lorraine continued, her voice almost gentle. "If I hadn't said anything, if I had simply walked out of this store without revealing who I was, what do you think would have happened next?" Damien's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed. Too fast, too nervous. Lorraine let out a small, almost disappointed sigh. "I'll tell you," she said. "Nothing. Nothing would have happened. No one would have apologized. No one would have felt the need to clarify store policies. And certainly no one would have cared whether or not I could afford to be here. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and suffocating. Damien grasped for damage control. "Dr. Hastings, I can assure you we don't discriminate here," he insisted. "This store, our brand, has always been inclusive." Lorraine smiled, but it wasn't kind. "Is that right?" She took a slow step forward, then another, closing the space between them. "Tell me something," she said, her voice lower now. "How many times have you assumed a customer wasn't serious just because of how they looked?" Damien stammered. Melissa stared at the floor. Vanessa was practically trembling. "Because I can guarantee," Lorraine continued, "that I am not the first, and I won't be the last." She turned slightly, addressing the store as a whole now. "You see, the problem isn't just this moment." She gestured lightly, her fingers sweeping through the air. "It's every moment before this one. Every time someone walks in and is judged before they've even said a word. Every time an assumption is made about who belongs and who doesn't." A pause. "Every time someone like me walks into a place like this and is made to feel small." Melissa shut her eyes briefly. Vanessa looked close to tears. Damien had lost all color in his face. Lorraine let the words settle before she spoke again. "But here's the thing, Damien." She leaned in slightly, just enough that he couldn't look away. "I'm not small." The weight of her statement hit like a hammer. Then she delivered the final blow. "And neither is my influence." Damien knew what that meant. "Dr. Hastings, please, you had your chance." Lorraine turned toward the exit, her steps measured, poised, but before she walked out, she paused. "Oh, and one more thing," she said, glancing over her shoulder. Damien flinched. "Expect a call from corporate." And with that, she left. But the story wasn't over yet. Lorraine stepped out into the crisp Charleston air, the boutique's doors gliding shut behind her with a whisper. The tension inside? She could still feel it clinging to her like static. She had no reason to look back. She had made her point. But as she adjusted her gloves, a faint reflection in the glass caught her attention. Vanessa. The young sales associate had followed her outside, her expression hesitant, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Lorraine took a slow breath, already knowing what was coming. "Dr. Hastings?" Vanessa's voice was softer now, stripped of the earlier arrogance. Lorraine turned, meeting her gaze. "Yes?" Vanessa hesitated, shifting awkwardly on her feet. I wanted to say I'm sorry." Lorraine raised an eyebrow but said nothing, waiting. Vanessa exhaled shakily. "I didn't mean to be rude." She rushed to explain. "It's just, well, we get a lot of people who come in and—" Lorraine held up a hand. "Stop!" Vanessa's mouth snapped shut. "Listen to yourself," Lorraine said, her voice calm but unapologetically firm. "We get a lot of people. And what? You decide who deserves respect based on a glance?" Vanessa's eyes glossed over. "I swear I wasn't trying to—" "You were," Lorraine interrupted, but not unkindly. "And that's the problem." Vanessa looked away. "It's just how things are," she murmured. Lorraine let out a slow, knowing breath. "Only if you let them be." Vanessa blinked, her gaze flicking back to Lorraine's. "People will tell you this is how the world works." Lorraine continued, her voice quieter now, but weighted with experience. "They'll tell you that it's just business, or it's nothing personal. But everything is personal, Vanessa. Everything." Vanessa swallowed hard, nodding. "So, what happens now?" she asked. Lorraine tilted her head. "For you? That depends." Vanessa looked confused. "On what?" Lorraine gave her a long, measured look before replying. "On whether or not you learn from this." Vanessa nodded quickly, like a child being scolded but desperate to prove they understood. "I will," she promised. Lorraine studied her for a moment, then gave a slow nod. "Good," she said simply. Without another word, she turned and walked away. Back inside the boutique, Damien Caldwell was still frozen in place. Melissa had stepped aside, face pale, lips pressed together. She knew what was coming. "What do we do?" she whispered. Damien didn't answer, because deep down, he already knew. His career at Lavelle Couture, it was hanging by a thread. And Lorraine Hastings had just sharpened the scissors. Respect? It's not a privilege. It's not something you ration out based on appearances, wealth, or assumptions. It's a standard. Lorraine Hastings wasn't looking for a luxury handbag. She was looking for decency. And that day, she reminded everyone in that boutique, respect isn't optional. It's a choice. Every single time. If this story made you think, then share it. Let people hear it, because the next time you find yourself in a situation like this, you'll have a choice too. What will you do?